Hi folks, welcome back from our extended spring break. We're going to try out a different format for the week. I'm uploading 3 sets of narrated slides that will cover this week's topic, which is speech acts. For these to make the most sense, you should make sure to read Chapter 10 in our textbook, the chapter called Indirect Speech Acts. You can read it before or after watching these slides. Speech act theory has aroused some of the widest interest of all the issues of language usage that have been studied. People in a variety of fields are interested in this topic. For example, psychologists have suggested that the acquisition of the concepts underlying speech acts may be a prerequisite for the acquisition of language in general. Literary critics have looked to speech act theory for an illumination of textual subtleties or for an understanding of the nature of literary genres. Anthropologists have hoped to find in it some account of the nature of magical spells, as well as more everyday rituals. Philosophers have seen potential applications to the status of ethical statements. And of course, linguists have seen the notion of speech act theory as applicable to problems in syntax, semantics, and second language learning. This material was first studied during a time when there was a great emphasis in checking the truth of statements. There was a period of time when scholars thought that unless a sentence could be verified as either true or false, it was meaningless. It was to counter this kind of idea that a couple of philosophers began focusing on language in use. One of these was J.L. Austin. Austin began by noting that some ordinary language declarative sentences are apparently not used with any intention of making true or false statements. These seem to form a special class, as you can see here in slide 3. He looked at sentences such as these: I bet you $6, I apologize, I dub thee Sir Walter, and so on. The thing that Austin noted about these sentences is that they are not used just to say things or to describe states of affairs, but rather they are uttered in order to actively do things. After you've declared war on Zanzibar, or dubbed Sir Walter a knight, or raised an objection, the world or the situation in the world has changed in substantial ways. Further, you cannot assess such utterances as true or false, as we see on the next slide. Here it would be marked with a pound sign to show that somebody could object to this by saying, oh, that's false, or no, that's not the case that you did this. Austin called these uses, like I promise and I dub, performatives, and contrasted them with statements, assertions, and utterances like those, which he called constantives. The study of these performative speech acts is just further emphasis of how inadequate it is to look only at truth-conditional meaning, as we've already seen when we saw the details of looking at Deixis and of Grice's work with the cooperative principle and implicature. So let's look at some of these classic cases of performative verbs. On this slide, which of these are performative verbs? That is, which of these, when you utter them, will inherently be a performance of that action? I bet that he will get here late versus I know the answer. I promise to be there versus I sit on this chair. So I bet you've guessed that the performatives here are bet and promise. Because once you say to someone, I bet you, you have actually bet someone. But if you say, I know the answer, you may or may not actually know the answer. You aren't performing knowing. And once you say, I promise you, you've actually made a promise. By saying, I sit on this chair, on the other hand, I may or may not be sitting when I say it, but saying it while I'm standing up doesn't make it an instance of sitting. So often these kind of performative verbs are further identified, and that's by using the special marker of hereby. This is an older sounding word, but you use it for official pronouncements of doing an act. Thus, I hereby christen this ship. I hereby order you to turn over the files. I hereby christen the ship Rocinante contrasts with I hereby sit on this chair. If I don't move from that position, I am not automatically now sitting. Again, we use the pound sign for the bottom two because with hereby, we're still not performing the named act, even if we put the word hereby in there. So far, so good? Now comes a jump. Austin went on to suggest that although, unlike constatives, performatives cannot be true or false, he did say that given their special nature, the question of truth or falsity doesn't arise, but sometimes things can still go wrong when you're uttering them. He set out to catalog all the ways in which they can go wrong, or be unhappy, or be infelicitous. For instance, suppose I say, I christen this ship the Rocinante. I may not succeed in so christening the vessel if, for instance, it is already otherwise named, or I'm not the appointed namer of ships, or are there no witnesses to the act, or there are no bottles of champagne present to smash it with, and so on. Successfully naming a ship requires certain institutional arrangements, without which the action that the utterance attempts to perform is simply null and void. On the basis of such different ways in which a performative can fail to come off, Austin produced a typology of conditions that performatives must meet if they are to succeed, and he called these felicity conditions. He distinguished three main categories of felicity conditions. We can see these on slide 11, labeled A, B, and C. There must be a conventional procedure having a conventional effect. That means it's recognized in the community. The circumstances and person must be appropriate as specified to the procedure. That is, sometimes only certain people can perform that role. The procedure must be executed correctly and completely. And for C, often the person must have the requisite thoughts, feelings, or intentions as specified for the procedure. And if the consequent conduct is specified, then the relevant parties must do so. That means people have to actually be intending or planning to perform this act, and they must be the designated people to do so. To see some of this in action, imagine that as a Protestant American citizen, I say to my spouse, I hereby divorce you. I will not thereby achieve a divorce because there is simply no such procedure as indicated in a condition A1, whereby merely uttering this sentence, a divorce can be achieved. In contrast, in some Muslim cultures, there is such a procedure whereby by uttering this sentence 3 times consecutively by a husband to his wife, it does thereby constitute a divorce. So it's very much culture specific. Looking at some of the other conditions as an illustration of a failure of A2, consider a clergyman baptizing the wrong baby, or the right baby with the wrong name, or consider the case of one head of state trying to welcome another but addressing their bodyguard in error. As for condition B1, the words must be conventionally the correct ones. So, for example, in a traditional wedding ceremony, if the minister says, Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, and forsaking all others keep thee only unto her, the bridegroom must respond with, I will. If he says, okay, the act is not officially done. As for condition B2, the procedure must be complete. Thus, if I say, I bet you $6, then for the bet to take effect, generally you must ratify the arrangement by saying something like, you're on, or something to that effect. In Austin's terms, for some acts like betting, there must be satisfactory uptake. Finally, violations of the C conditions are things we'd call insincerities. So to advise someone to do something when you really think it would be advantageous for you but not for them, or for a juror to find a defendant guilty when they know him to be innocent, would be a violation of C1. And to promise to do something which you have no intention whatsoever of doing would be a straightforward violation of C2. Austin notes that these violations are not all of equal stature. So violations of A and B conditions give rise to misfires. That is, the intended actions simply fail to come off. Violations of C conditions, on the other hand, are abuses not so easily detected at the time of the utterance in question, with the consequence that the action is performed, but performed infelicitously or insincerely. Searle elaborates on felicity conditions and compares the conditions that distinguish requests from promises, for example. You can see that on page 187 in our Kroger book. These are similar but slightly different categories, that is, requests and promises, which have to do with sincerity of the speaker, ability of the speaker or hearer to perform the act, and so on. We'll talk about those in a little bit. Okay, originally Austin posits that there are some special sentences called performatives, which by uttering means that we do things as well. And unlike constatives, which are assessed in terms of truth and falsity, performatives can only be assessed as felicitous or infelicitous, according to whether their felicity conditions are met or not. Later, the theory was expanded to move beyond these two categories of utterances. In fact, we'll see that most things that we utter actually have an illocutionary force, a performative force, but it's not always as perfectly matched up with a particular type of verb or sentence form. Instead, it's our performing of speech acts we see is often done indirectly. Before we go there, however, here's our chance to try out this distinction of speech acts performed through performative verbs and through other sentences, constatives, that don't have those performative verbs. Stop this video for a minute or two and ask yourself which of the following utterances are performative and which are constative. Okay, and here is the answer to that. While we're speaking of taxonomies, let's look at the various kinds of language-related acts that Austin laid out. The top one, locutionary act, really just means the act of speaking, as opposed to other kinds of actions like eating or dancing or sneezing. The one in the middle, illocutionary act, this is the performance of some act via speaking. So this is what we mostly talk about when we think of speech acts. So these are things like command, request, promise, apologize, where by uttering it, you're also performing that act. And then he also talks about this third type, perlocutionary acts, which is kind of a secondary, not always necessary act that can also be performed by speaking, and there can be many of these for each act. To clarify perlocutionary acts, imagine that while watching a police show on TV, someone utters this, "Shoot him." In the appropriate circumstances, the utterance can have the illocutionary force of several things. Remember, the illocutionary force is the performative speech act. So we could identify that as an act of ordering, an act of urging, an act of advising the addressee to shoot someone, right? In addition, it may have that third perlocutionary effect of actually also frightening the guy being talked about, or angering him, or maybe just frightening the addressee, or even amusing bystanders. Those would be sort of the secondary effects. Okay, I think that's enough for round 1 of this new format. So when you're ready to move on to Speech Acts Part 2, that will be available in the same link that I'm sending you. And don't forget to read the Kroger Chapter 10 as well to make more sense of this. Thanks.